The streets of Chicago were unforgiving in winter. Daniel Carter sat slumped against a crumbling brick wall, his tattered coat pulled tightly around him. The biting wind cut through the thin fabric, chilling him to the bone. His cardboard sign, hastily scrawled with the words "Veteran in Need of Help," rested against his knees. He watched the faceless crowd shuffle by, each person lost in their own world, their eyes fixed anywhere but on him. Daniel had once been a proud soldier, serving his country in Afghanistan. He had been part of something bigger than himself, protecting others and making a difference. But those days felt like another lifetime. After returning home, he had struggled to adjust, haunted by the sights and sounds of war. The nightmares, the bouts of rage, and the endless parade of job rejections eventually led to his downfall. A failed marriage, mounting debts, and the cold indifference of society had left him here, alone, broken, and invisible. A wave of hopelessness washed over him as he watched people hurry past without so much as a glance in his direction. The faint jingling of coins in his cup mocked him, a cruel reminder of his descent. He tried to muster the courage to ask for help, but the shame always swallowed his words. As the day wore on, Daniel's fingers stiffened in the cold, and his stomach growled in protest. He glanced up, squinting against the bright sunlight, reflecting off the skyscrapers. That's when he saw it, a sleek, black SUV crawling through the congested street. The vehicle's polished exterior gleamed, an unmistakable emblem of wealth and success. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Maybe this driver would be different. Rising to his feet, he grabbed his sign and stepped closer to the curb, careful not to look too desperate. He raised the sign slightly, making sure it was visible. The SUV slowed as it approached, caught in the snarl of traffic. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw the driver glance his way. His chest tightened with a flicker of hope. Inside the car, Jonathan Reynolds tapped impatiently on the steering wheel, cursing the traffic under his breath. He was a man used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. The delay was an annoyance, and the sight of a homeless man approaching his car only deepened his irritation. Daniel mustered his courage, taking a step closer. He raised his hand in a small wave, his lips trembling as he began to speak. But before he could utter a word, the light turned green, and the SUV began to inch forward. "Please, sir," Daniel called out, his voice cracking. "I just need a little help. Anything you can spare?" For a moment, Jonathan hesitated, his hand hovering over the window controls. Then, with a disdainful sneer, he rolled down the window just enough to be heard. "You're pathetic," Jonathan said, his voice cold and cutting. "Get a job like everyone else." Before Daniel could respond, Jonathan tossed a few crumpled bills through the narrow opening. They fluttered to the ground at Daniel's feet, accompanied by the splash of dirty street water as the SUV sped away. Daniel stood frozen, the bills soaked and sticking to the wet pavement. His face burned with humiliation, and his hands clenched into fists. Around him, a few onlookers shook their heads in disapproval, but no one intervened. He stooped to pick up the wet money, swallowing his pride as tears pricked his eyes. As he straightened, the rumble of an engine and the sharp screech of tires shattered the silence. Daniel's head snapped up just in time to see the black SUV swerve wildly, slamming into a streetlight with a deafening crash. The impact sent shards of glass and metal flying. Smoke began to billow from the hood. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing. Then his training as a combat medic took over. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the wreckage, his heart pounding in his chest. The driver's life depended on him now, no matter what had happened just moments before. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as Daniel approached the mangled SUV. The hood was crumpled like a discarded tin can, and flames licked at the edges of the shattered windshield. Onlookers gathered at a safe distance, murmuring and recording videos on their phones, but no one dared to step forward. Inside the vehicle, Jonathan Reynolds groaned, his head slumped against the deflating airbag. A thin line of blood trickled down his temple, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. The sharp metallic screech of the crash still echoed in his ears, leaving him disoriented and terrified. Daniel reached the driver's side door and tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. The frame was bent, trapping Jonathan inside. He glanced around and spotted a heavy piece of metal debris nearby, a broken street sign pole. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and began prying at the door, his muscles straining with the effort. "Hey, someone call 911. Daniel shouted over his shoulder, his voice commanding and urgent. The crowd hesitated, but a woman in the back fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. Jonathan stirred, blinking through the haze of smoke. His eyes locked on Daniel, but recognition didn't register. All he saw was a scruffy, mud-splattered figure trying to break into his car. "Get away from me," Jonathan croaked, his voice weak but laced with panic. "Shut up and stay still," Daniel barked, his tone firm and unwavering. "I'm trying to save your life." With a final grunt, Daniel managed to wedge the door open just enough to pull Jonathan out. The man was heavier than he looked, his designer suit and coat adding to the weight. Daniel gritted his teeth and dragged him away from the vehicle as the flames grew more aggressive, threatening to engulf the entire car. When they were a safe distance away, Daniel gently laid Jonathan on the ground and began assessing his injuries. His training kicked in like second nature, checking for broken bones, stabilizing his neck, and ensuring his airway was clear. "Stay with me," Daniel said, his voice softer now but still resolute. "You're gonna be fine. Help is on the way." Jonathan coughed weakly, his breaths labored. His gaze darted to the growing crowd, then back to Daniel. For the first time, he seemed to register who his rescuer was. "You're," Jonathan began, but his voice trailed off. His head lolled to the side, his body going limp. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He leaned closer, his fingers searching for a pulse. It was there, weak, but steady. Relieved, he positioned Jonathan for recovery and began administering CPR when the man's breathing faltered. Each compression brought back memories of the battlefield, of comrades he had saved and others he had lost. The wail of sirens broke through the chaos. An ambulance screeched to a halt nearby, and paramedics rushed to take over. Daniel stepped back, his hands shaking and his chest heaving. He watched as the professionals worked, stabilizing Jonathan and loading him onto a stretcher. "Did you pull him out?" one of the paramedics asked, glancing at Daniel with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lucky you were here," the paramedic said. "You might have just saved his life." Daniel didn't respond. He stood there, his mind reeling, as the ambulance doors slammed shut and sped away into the night. Around him, the crowd began to disperse, their interest waning now that the excitement was over. Left alone on the sidewalk, Daniel looked down at his mud-streaked hands. The adrenaline that had fueled him moments ago began to fade, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. He sank onto the curb, staring at the distant red and blue lights of the ambulance. The man he had saved was the same one who had humiliated him minutes earlier, throwing crumpled bills and insults at him without a second thought. Despite everything, Daniel had acted without hesitation. It wasn't gratitude or recognition he sought. It was instinct, his duty to help, no matter who it was. Yet, as the night deepened and the cold seeped into his bones, Daniel couldn't shake the bitter irony of it all. For the first time in years, he had been seen, not as a homeless man begging on the streets, but as a hero. But Daniel knew the fleeting moment of acknowledgement would pass. Tomorrow, he'd be invisible again. The following morning, Daniel sat hunched against the same brick wall he had called home for months. The frigid air nipped at his fingers, and his cardboard sign rested beside him, forgotten. He was lost in thought, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in his mind. The crash, the flames, the man's terrified face as he pulled him to safety. Despite his exhaustion, sleep had eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, the familiar pang of helplessness returned. For a brief moment during the rescue, he had felt alive again, like the soldier he once was. But now, in the harsh light of day, he was just another invisible figure on the streets of Chicago. Across the city, Jonathan Reynolds awoke in a hospital bed, his body aching and his head throbbing. His assistant, Olivia, stood at his bedside, scrolling through her phone with a tight-lipped expression. "You're awake," she said, setting her phone down and approaching him. "How are you feeling?" Like I got hit by a truck, Jonathan muttered, wincing as he shifted in bed. What happened? You crashed your car into a streetlight, Olivia replied, her tone clipped. The doctors said you're lucky to be alive. They also said it wasn't luck that saved you. Jonathan frowned, his mind foggy. Bits and pieces of the crash came back to him. The blinding headlights, the screech of tires, the acrid smell of smoke. And then, a face. There was a man, Jonathan said slowly. He pulled me out of the car. Olivia nodded, her eyes narrowing. That man is all over the internet right now. She picked up her phone and tapped the screen before holding it out to him. Jonathan squinted at the video playing on the screen. It showed a blurry figure, mud-streaked, ragged, and determined, dragging him out of the wreckage. The crowd's gasps and murmurs could be heard in the background, along with someone shouting, "He saved his life." The video had been shared thousands of times, with captions ranging from "Homeless hero saves businessman" to "Veterans' instincts kick in." The comments were a mix of praise for the rescuer and scorn for the man who had needed saving. Jonathan's stomach churned as he scrolled through the comments. That's what a true hero looks like. Imagine being saved by someone you probably wouldn't even look at on the street. I hope this guy gets the help he deserves. Jonathan handed the phone back to Olivia, his face pale. Who is he? That's the thing, Olivia said, crossing her arms. No one knows. He left before the paramedics could talk to him. All anyone knows is that he's a homeless veteran. Jonathan stared at the ceiling, guilt and shame tightening around his chest like a vice. He remembered the way he had treated the man, mocking him, throwing money at him like he was nothing. And yet, that same man had risked his life to save him. I need to find him, Jonathan said, his voice firm. Find him? Olivia raised an eyebrow. Why? So you can hand him another wad of cash and call it even? Jonathan flinched at her words, but didn't respond. He didn't fully understand it himself, but he felt an overwhelming need to make things right. For the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly, not as the successful businessman he had always prided himself on being, but as a man who had lost his humanity somewhere along the way. While Jonathan grappled with his conscience, Daniel was back on the streets, trying to avoid the sudden attention. People who had seen the viral video began to approach him, some offering thanks, others snapping pictures without asking. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that went beyond the physical. I'm no hero, he muttered under his breath as another stranger pointed a phone in his direction. By evening, Daniel had moved to a quieter part of the city, away from the prying eyes. He didn't want to be a spectacle, he just wanted to survive. But as he sat beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, a small voice inside him wondered if the world might see him differently now. And for the first time in years, that thought terrified him. At the same moment, in a high-rise office overlooking the Chicago skyline, Jonathan made a decision. He would find the man who saved him, no matter what it took. And when he did, he would prove that people could change, even someone like him. In the days following the crash, the video of Daniel's heroic rescue continued to spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines like, "Homeless veteran becomes unlikely hero," and "A businessman's life saved by the man he mocked." Social media buzzed with conversations about homelessness, veteran struggles, and acts of humanity. But Daniel Carter wanted no part of it. The attention made him uneasy, the spotlight shining too brightly on a life he wanted to forget. Every time someone recognized him, he would move to a different corner of the city, hoping to blend back into the shadows. He hadn't saved Jonathan Reynolds for fame or recognition. He'd done it because it was instinct, an echo of the duty ingrained in him during his years as a combat medic. Still, the ripple effects of his actions were undeniable. People began leaving him food and supplies without asking. A few kind-hearted individuals even offered him money or temporary shelter. But Daniel refused most of it, wary of charity that came with expectations or strings attached. One evening, as he sat on a bench in a quiet park, a young woman approached him hesitantly. She held out a steaming cup of coffee and a bag of sandwiches. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked softly. "The man from the video?" Daniel glanced at her and sighed. "I'm just a guy who happened to be there at the right time." "You're a hero," she insisted, placing the coffee and sandwiches beside him. "I don't care what you think. What you did was incredible." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He stared at the coffee, the warmth rising from the cup reminding him of the life he used to have, a life of purpose, discipline, and camaraderie. But that life felt impossibly far away now. Across town, Jonathan Reynolds was recovering in the hospital, both physically and emotionally. The bruises and cuts on his body were healing faster than the wounds to his pride. He had spent his life building an empire, priding himself on his ruthlessness and sharp business acumen. Yet, in his moment of greatest vulnerability, the man he had demeaned had been the one to save him. The memory of Daniel's face haunted him. It wasn't just the man's disheveled appearance or the mud smeared on his clothes. It was his eyes. They were sharp, focused, filled with a determination that Jonathan hadn't seen in himself in years. "I need to do something," Jonathan muttered as Olivia entered his hospital room. She raised an eyebrow. "Something like what?" "Find him. Help him." Jonathan's voice was firmer now, his gaze steady. "I owe him my life." Olivia crossed her arms. "Helping him doesn't erase what you did. You humiliated him, Jonathan. You can't just throw money at this and expect it to go away." "I'm not trying to make it go away," Jonathan snapped, then took a deep breath, softening his tone. "I want to make things right. I need to." Olivia studied him for a moment before sighing. "Fine, I'll see what I can do. But don't expect this to be easy. A man like that? He probably doesn't want to be found." Meanwhile, the story was creating waves beyond the city. Advocacy groups for veterans began using Daniel's story to highlight the plight of homeless servicemen and women. Politicians and activists debated solutions on television, some calling for better reintegration programs, while others decried the systemic failures that left heroes like Daniel on the streets. Daniel, however, remained oblivious to the larger conversation. He had managed to find a quieter spot near the outskirts of the city, away from the prying eyes of reporters and well-meaning strangers. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change, whether he wanted it to or not. One night, as Daniel huddled beneath an overpass, he heard footsteps approaching. He tensed, ready to fend off whoever might be encroaching on his temporary refuge. To his surprise, a sharply dressed man stepped into the dim light, flanked by two others in more casual clothing. "Daniel Carter?" the man asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Daniel narrowed his eyes, his instincts screaming caution. "Who's asking?" "My name is Ryan Miller," the man said, holding out a business card. "I work for Jonathan Reynolds. He's been looking for you." At the mention of Reynolds' name, Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested." "Wait," Ryan said quickly, sensing Daniel's resistance. "This isn't about charity or pity. Mr. Reynolds wanted to thank you personally. He feels he owes you a debt." Daniel's eyes hardened. "I didn't save him for a reward." "I know," Ryan said, his tone earnest, "but he still wants to meet you. Please, just hear him out." Daniel stared at the card in Ryan's outstretched hand. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to walk in the opposite direction and leave this chapter of his life behind. But another part, quieter yet insistent, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this meeting could lead to something more than the hollow existence he had come to accept. Without a word, Daniel took the card. "I'll think about it," he said gruffly, turning back to his makeshift shelter. Ryan nodded, stepping back into the shadows. "Take all the time you need. We'll be waiting." As the footsteps faded into the night, Daniel sat alone beneath the overpass, the card clenched in his hand. For the first time in years, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirred within him. Hope. Jonathan Reynolds had always prided himself on control over his business, his image, and his destiny. But now, for the first time, he found himself humbled, grappling with a debt he couldn't repay in dollars or contracts. The memory of Daniel Carter, the man who had risked everything to save him, loomed large in his mind. After days of waiting, Ryan Miller returned to Jonathan's hospital room, his face betraying no emotion as he delivered his report. "I found him," Ryan said simply. Jonathan sat up, the tension in his body easing. "And? Did he agree to meet? Ryan hesitated. Not yet. He took your card, but he's hesitant. He's not looking for a handout, and he doesn't seem comfortable with attention. Jonathan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I don't blame him. After the way I treated him. His voice trailed off, a rare vulnerability cracking through his usual bravado. What now? Ryan asked. Jonathan stared out the window, the Chicago skyline a blur of lights and shadows. If he won't come to me, then I'll go to him. Ryan blinked in surprise. You want to meet him where he is? On the streets? Yes, Jonathan said firmly. And don't try to talk me out of it. 2 nights later, Jonathan, dressed in plain clothes that were a far cry from his usual tailored suits, stood on the edge of a dimly lit street corner. The air was biting, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. Ryan and a security detail lingered discreetly nearby, but Jonathan had insisted on doing this alone. He scanned the area, his eyes searching for the man who had haunted his thoughts. Eventually, he spotted him, Daniel Carter, sitting beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp, his shoulders hunched and his face partially obscured by a knit cap. Jonathan hesitated, his chest tightening with nerves. This was a man who had every reason to resent him, and yet he had saved his life. How could he begin to bridge the chasm between them? Summoning his courage, Jonathan approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate. Daniel noticed him immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing in recognition. What are you doing here? Daniel asked, his tone cautious but not hostile. I came to thank you, Jonathan said, stopping a few feet away, and to apologize. Daniel's expression didn't soften. You already thanked me. That's what the card was for, right? That wasn't enough, Jonathan replied earnestly. I owe you more than words, Daniel. I owe you my life. Daniel let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would have done. No, Jonathan said firmly. Not anyone. I've seen the way people walk past you, like you're invisible. I was one of them. His voice wavered, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. I treated you like garbage, and you still saved me. Why? Daniel's gaze grew distant, his voice quiet. Because it's what I was trained to do. I wasn't thinking about you, or what you'd done. I just saw someone who needed help. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the hum of passing traffic. I want to help you, Jonathan said finally, his tone imploring. Not because I think you need charity, but because I want to make things right. Please, let me do that. Daniel studied him, his expression unreadable. Help me? How? You think throwing money at me is going to fix anything? No, Jonathan admitted. But maybe I can do something meaningful. Something that matters to you. Daniel scoffed, his skepticism clear. You don't even know what matters to me. Then tell me, Jonathan said, his voice steady. Help me understand. Daniel stared at him for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. There's a shelter, he said reluctantly. A place for vets like me. They're always short on supplies, funding, you name it. If you really want to do something that matters, start there. Jonathan nodded, his heart lifting slightly. I will. But that's just the beginning. Daniel's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. We'll see. The next morning, Jonathan made good on his promise. He reached out to the shelter Daniel had mentioned, speaking directly with its coordinator, a no-nonsense woman named Grace Hernandez. She was wary at first, accustomed to empty promises from people who wanted to appear charitable without putting in real effort. I'm serious about this, Jonathan assured her. Tell me what you need, and I'll make it happen. Grace raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed. We need everything. Food, medical supplies, mental health services. But what we need most is stability, consistent support, not just a one-time check. Jonathan's determination only grew. Then that's what you'll get. He worked tirelessly over the next week, leveraging his business connections and personal resources to secure funding, donations, and volunteers for the shelter. True to his word, he didn't stop at writing a check. He visited the shelter himself, meeting the veterans and listening to their stories. When Grace saw his genuine commitment, her skepticism began to melt away. "I have to admit," she said one afternoon, "you're not what I expected." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Neither am I." Meanwhile, Daniel kept his distance, unsure of how to feel about Jonathan's sudden transformation. Part of him wanted to believe it was genuine, but another part feared it was just another rich man's vanity project. It wasn't until Grace invited him back to the shelter to see the changes for himself that Daniel reluctantly agreed to go. When he arrived, he was stunned. The once cramped, underfunded space was now bustling with activity. Stocked shelves, new equipment, and a fresh coat of paint on the walls. As he stood in the doorway, Grace approached him with a warm smile. "Thought you might want to see what your suggestion started." Daniel glanced around, his throat tightening. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the countless others who shared his struggle. In that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't only for Jonathan Reynolds. It could be for him too. The air inside the shelter was warm, carrying the faint aroma of fresh coffee and newly delivered bread. Daniel stood at the edge of the activity, watching as veterans chatted, laughed, and sifted through donated supplies. The room, which had once felt cramped and lifeless, now buzzed with energy and purpose. Yet, Daniel couldn't shake the strange mix of emotions roiling inside him. Gratitude for the improvements, skepticism about Jonathan Reynolds' motives, and an uneasy sense of being out of place. Grace Hernandez, the shelter's sharp-eyed coordinator, appeared at his side. Her arms were crossed, but her smile was soft. "Not bad, huh?" Daniel nodded. "It's impressive." "Impressive doesn't cover it," Grace said. "This place was barely hanging on a few weeks ago. Now we're fully stocked, and I've got a waiting list of volunteers." Reynolds really came through. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You trust him?" Grace shrugged. "Trust is earned. But I'll tell you this, he's been here almost every day. Not just writing checks either. He listens, asks questions, wants to know what we actually need. That's more than most." Daniel glanced across the room and spotted Jonathan speaking with an older veteran, his expression attentive and engaged. For a moment, Daniel's skepticism wavered. Maybe the man really was trying to change. "Anyway," Grace continued, pulling Daniel out of his thoughts, "there's someone here who wants to talk to you. Come with me." Grace led Daniel to a small, makeshift office in the back of the shelter. Inside, Jonathan sat at a worn wooden desk, flipping through a stack of papers. When he saw Daniel, he stood immediately, his face lighting up with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Daniel," Jonathan said, extending a hand, "I'm glad you came." Daniel hesitated before shaking his hand briefly. "Grace said you wanted to talk." Jonathan nodded and gestured for him to sit. "I won't take up too much of your time. I wanted to thank you again, in person, for what you did. And I wanted to see if there's anything more I can do to help." Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You've done plenty already. The shelter looks better than ever." "That's just the start," Jonathan said earnestly. "I want to do more, not just for the shelter, but for you." "For me?" Daniel's tone was laced with suspicion. Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I know you didn't ask for this, and I know you don't want charity, but I see the way people look up to you here. You have something special, experience, leadership, compassion. I want to help you use it." Daniel frowned. "I don't follow." "I'm offering you a chance to work here," Jonathan said. "Full-time, if you're interested. Grace and I have already talked about it. You'd be helping other veterans, using your medical training, your knowledge, your story. You could make a real difference." Daniel's heart raced. The offer was tempting, almost too tempting. For years, he had drifted aimlessly, burdened by guilt and the weight of his past. The idea of having purpose again, of being part of something meaningful, was almost too much to hope for. But doubt crept in like a shadow. "Why me?" he asked, his voice low. "There are plenty of other vets who could do the same thing." "Maybe," Jonathan admitted, "but none of them saved my life. None of them made me see how blind I was to the struggles of people like you. You opened my eyes, Daniel. The least I can do is give you the tools to help others." Daniel looked away, his thoughts swirling. He wanted to believe in Jonathan's sincerity, but a lifetime of disappointment had taught him to be cautious. "What's the catch?" he asked finally. "No catch," Jonathan said. "Just an opportunity. It's up to you whether you take it." Grace, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Daniel, we could really use someone like you. You've seen what it's like out there. You know how to talk to these guys in a way no one else can. And with your medical skills," she trailed off, letting the weight of her words sink in. Daniel sat in silence, his mind a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He thought of the soldiers he had treated on the front lines, the lives he had saved and lost. He thought of the cold, lonely nights on the streets, the bitterness of being invisible to the world. And he thought of the people here, the veterans who were finally getting the help they needed because of Jonathan's efforts. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice measured. Jonathan nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. "That's all I can ask." Over the next few days, Daniel found himself spending more time at the shelter. He helped organize supplies, patched up minor injuries, and even shared stories from his time in the service. The other veterans gravitated toward him, drawn by his quiet strength and unassuming demeanor. One evening, as he was wrapping a bandage around a man's hand, Grace approached him with a clipboard. "Still thinking about it?" she asked, her tone light. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. Well, don't think too long," she said with a grin. "You're already doing the job. Might as well get paid for it." Daniel chuckled softly, but her words lingered in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere, like he had a purpose again. Later that night, as he sat on the steps outside the shelter, Jonathan joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," Jonathan said, handing him a cup, "when I first came here, I thought I was helping you. But the truth is, you've helped me just as much." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" "I've spent my life chasing success, thinking money was the only thing that mattered," Jonathan admitted. "But you showed me there's more to life than that. You reminded me what it means to really care about people." Daniel took a sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. "Guess we're both learning something then?" Jonathan smiled. "So, what do you say? Ready to make this official?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared out at the city, the lights twinkling like distant stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the future. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." Jonathan's smile widened, and for a moment, they sat in companionable silence, 2 men from vastly different worlds brought together by a twist of fate and a shared desire to make things right. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the shelter feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. After weeks of uncertainty, he was ready to embrace this new chapter of his life. Grace greeted him with a wide smile, clipboard in hand. "Good to see you bright and early," she said. "Ready to jump in?" Daniel nodded, though the weight of responsibility hung heavily on him. "Let's get to it." Grace led him to his new workspace, a modest office tucked into the corner of the shelter. It wasn't much, just a desk, a chair, and a small filing cabinet, but to Daniel, it felt like a second chance. "You'll be coordinating medical care for the vets," Grace explained. "Basic first aid, checkups, helping them connect with specialists when needed. And," she added with a smirk, "you'll be dealing with the occasional stubborn old-timer who thinks he doesn't need help." Daniel chuckled, already picturing the challenge. "Sounds like half my unit back in the day." "Exactly," Grace said. "But you've got the skills, and more importantly, you've got their respect. They'll listen to you." Daniel sat down at the desk, his hands brushing over the surface as if grounding himself in this new reality. It had been a long time since he'd felt this kind of purpose, a sense that he was contributing to something larger than himself. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into his work. He organized first aid classes, set up partnerships with local clinics, and worked tirelessly to ensure the veterans received the care they needed. The shelter had never been busier, but Daniel thrived under the pressure. One afternoon, Jonathan arrived unannounced, carrying a large box of supplies. He set it down with a grunt, then straightened, looking around at the bustling shelter. "This place is incredible," Jonathan said, watching as volunteers and veterans worked side by side. It's like a whole different world from when I first saw it. Daniel glanced up from a stack of medical charts. A lot of people have put in the effort to make that happen. And you're one of them, Jonathan pointed out. You've done more in a few weeks than most people do in a lifetime. Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Just doing my part. Jonathan smiled. You know, I've been thinking about what you said, that it's not about throwing money at a problem. It's about creating real change. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. I want you to have this, for the shelter, for whatever you need. Daniel unfolded the check and stared at the amount, his eyes widening. It was a donation so large it could keep the shelter running for years. For a moment, he was speechless. This is a lot, Daniel finally said. It's the least I can do, Jonathan replied. And it's not just for the shelter. It's for the people who come here, the ones who deserve a second chance. Daniel's grip on the check tightened. He knew exactly what this money could do. New beds, better medical equipment, expanded programs for mental health and job training. But he also knew it wasn't just about the money. It was about making sure it was used wisely. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice steady. But if we're going to use this, we're going to do it right. Every penny goes toward helping these guys get back on their feet. Jonathan nodded, his respect for Daniel deepening. I wouldn't expect anything less. The donation sparked a ripple effect throughout the community. When word got out about Jonathan's generosity, other businesses and individuals began stepping forward to contribute. The shelter received new mattresses, medical supplies, and even a donated van to transport veterans to appointments and job interviews. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a tale of redemption and second chances. Reporters flocked to the shelter, eager to interview both Jonathan and Daniel. While Jonathan handled the press with practiced ease, Daniel remained wary of the attention, deflecting questions about his heroism. It's not about me, Daniel told one reporter firmly. It's about the guys out there who need help, the ones who've been forgotten. That's where the focus should be. His humility only endeared him further to the public, and donations continued to pour in. One evening, after a particularly long day, Daniel found himself sitting in the shelter's common room, surrounded by veterans. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation as they shared stories and plans for the future. Grace sat down beside him, a cup of coffee in hand. You've done good, Daniel, she said, her voice warm. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a rare smile tugging at his lips. It's not just me. It's everyone here. Jonathan, you, the volunteers. We're all in this together. Grace nodded, but her gaze was steady. You've been the heart of it, though. You've shown these guys that it's possible to come back from anything. That means something. Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked around the room, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, like he was part of a family again. Maybe, he said finally, his voice soft, but we've still got a lot of work to do. Grace chuckled. Always the humble one. Huh? Well, don't worry. We'll keep you busy. As the evening wore on, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. The man who had once wandered the streets, invisible and broken, was now a leader, a mentor, and a source of hope for others. And as he sat among his fellow veterans, he realized that he had found something far more valuable than redemption. A renewed sense of purpose and a chance to leave the world better than he had found it. It had been a month since Daniel officially joined the shelter as its full-time medical coordinator. The once quiet establishment had transformed into a thriving hub of activity, attracting more veterans, volunteers, and donations than ever before. Daniel watched the changes unfold daily. How the veterans found renewed hope, how the facility grew, how the old walls seemed to hum with energy. It was nothing short of miraculous. Yet, despite all the progress, Daniel couldn't shake a persistent feeling. He knew that while their efforts had made a significant impact, the work had only just begun. The shelter was a beacon of light, but it wasn't enough. The real challenge lay beyond these walls, the systems that had failed so many of these men and women in the first place. It was one thing to offer them food, shelter, and medical care. It was another to help them truly reintegrate into society and rebuild their lives from the ground up. Grace noticed the weight on Daniel's shoulders as he worked late one evening, his eyes scanning reports of the veteran's progress. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she observed, setting down a cup of coffee beside him. "I'm just thinking about what's next," Daniel replied. "We've made a lot of progress here, but I can't help but wonder if we're doing enough. These guys need more than just a place to sleep. They need real opportunities to get back on their feet, jobs, training, support systems." Grace nodded thoughtfully, taking a seat beside him. "You're right. And I think you've got the key to making that happen. You've got their trust, Daniel. More than anyone else, they believe in you. Maybe it's time to think about pushing the envelope beyond just the shelter." Daniel met her gaze, his brow furrowing. "You mean expand the programs? Offer job training and placement, financial literacy, maybe even help with housing?" "Exactly," Grace said. "The work you're doing here is important, but the bigger picture is even more crucial. We can create a network of resources, collaborate with local businesses, city programs, even veterans organizations, to help these men and women rebuild their lives for good." Daniel leaned back, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table. He had always believed in action over words, in small steps that led to lasting change. But Grace was right. The time had come to scale up the efforts, to push for real reform. But it wouldn't be easy. They would need funding, political backing, and the right partnerships. "I'll need to talk to Jonathan," Daniel said, his tone serious. "This will take a lot more than just donations. We'll need people who can help us get the right doors open." The following week, Jonathan joined Daniel and Grace in the shelter's conference room. The sight of Jonathan, a man whose life had once been filled with boardrooms and luxury cars, sitting across from them in a worn chair, with sleeves rolled up, symbolized the depth of his commitment to this cause. Gone was the businessman who had once dismissed the homeless as mere charity cases. In his place sat someone truly willing to listen and act. "I've been thinking about what you said, Daniel," Jonathan began, his voice steady. "We can't stop at just providing basic care. If we want to truly change lives, we have to tackle the root of the problem. We need to provide education, job opportunities, and housing solutions. This needs to be a holistic effort." Daniel looked at him closely. "You sure about that? It's going to be a massive undertaking. It won't be just a few more donations. It'll take years of consistent work, and we'll have to keep pushing for systemic change." "I'm ready for it," Jonathan said without hesitation. "I've learned more in the past few months than I ever did in the boardrooms of my company. I've seen the effects of neglect, of indifference, and I've seen the power of compassion. I'm in this for the long haul." Grace smiled at the determination in Jonathan's eyes. "That's exactly what we need. We can't do this alone, but with the right partners, we can move mountains. Together, we'll build something that lasts." The three of them spent the next several hours hashing out a plan. A multifaceted approach to veteran reintegration that included job training programs, collaborations with local businesses willing to hire veterans, financial literacy workshops, and a long-term housing program. They would also create an outreach initiative to educate the public about the realities of homelessness and the challenges veterans faced. "Let's make this official," Jonathan said, rising from the table. "I'll start reaching out to our partners and make some calls. We'll need a dedicated team to handle the logistics. We'll also need a solid PR campaign to raise awareness. I want to get the city behind us." Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it, the beginning of something far greater than the shelter they had built. This was about changing lives on a grand scale. The ripple effect of their efforts began almost immediately. Word spread quickly about the shelter's new initiatives. The media picked up the story, highlighting how Daniel's experience and leadership were helping shape a new model for veteran support. Interviews, news articles, and even a feature on a national morning show brought the cause into the spotlight. But it wasn't just the media attention that sparked change. It was the tangible results that began to show up in real time. Local businesses stepped forward, offering job training and employment opportunities for the veterans. The first cohort of veterans graduated from a resume building workshop, some of them securing full-time positions within a month. The city's Department of Housing began to engage with the shelter's leadership, offering resources for affordable housing. A month later, Daniel found himself standing in front of a packed room at a local conference center. It was a milestone, the first public gathering of the new veteran reintegration program, where partners, supporters, and veterans themselves would gather to celebrate their progress and share their stories. As Daniel stood at the podium, looking out over the crowd, his heart swelled with pride. This was the moment he had envisioned but never dared to hope for. The moment when all the hard work, all the sacrifice, began to pay off. The veterans who had once struggled alone were now surrounded by a community that cared, that understood, and that was committed to seeing them succeed. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said, his voice ringing out across the room. "What we're building here isn't just a program, it's a movement. A movement that says no one, no veteran, should ever have to face the streets alone again. A movement that says every person deserves a chance to rebuild their life." The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight on his shoulders lift. He had taken the first step toward creating something lasting, something that would continue to help others long after he was gone. As he looked around the room, he saw Jonathan, standing with Grace, their faces beaming with pride. This wasn't just Daniel's victory, it was theirs. And it was only the beginning. That night, after the event, as Daniel and Jonathan walked back to the shelter, Jonathan clapped him on the back. "You did it, Daniel. You've changed everything." Daniel smiled, but his eyes were focused on the path ahead. "No, we've changed everything." And together, they continued their walk toward the future, toward a world where no veteran would ever feel invisible again. It had been a few weeks since the grand event, and the shelter was now more than just a place for veterans to receive care. It had become a symbol of hope and a hub for change. Daniel's vision was slowly taking shape, but as much as he had accomplished, there was still more to be done. One crisp morning, as Daniel prepared for another busy day at the shelter, he received a call that would stir up emotions he had long buried. The voice on the other end was familiar, one he hadn't heard in years but would never forget. "Daniel?" The voice was hesitant but unmistakable. Daniel froze for a moment, his hand tightening around the phone. "Dad?" There was a long pause before his father spoke again, his tone a mix of uncertainty and genuine remorse. "I've been following your work, and I've heard about everything you've been doing. I'm proud of you. I think it's time we talked." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. It had been years since he'd heard from his father. Years since the man who had once abandoned him had reached out. The wounds from their past were still raw, but Daniel knew this conversation had to happen. He couldn't keep running from it. "When do you want to meet?" Daniel asked, his voice even, though the tension in his chest was palpable. "I'll come to you," his father replied. "I know it's not easy, but I think we owe it to each other to face the past. I'll be there this afternoon." By the time his father arrived at the shelter, Daniel was pacing in the small office, trying to steady his thoughts. He had spent years working to build something meaningful, something that could help others, and now, the man who had played such a pivotal role in his abandonment was here, standing at the threshold of everything Daniel had fought for. When Daniel finally stepped into the reception area, he saw him. His father, older now, his face lined with regret but still recognizable, was standing at the door, shifting uncomfortably. "Daniel," his father said quietly, as though unsure of what to say next. "It's been a long time." Daniel nodded, his voice cold but not unkind. "You could say that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with history, a history filled with unresolved anger, abandonment, and years of silence. But Daniel wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't the young man who had once yearned for his father's approval. He was a man who had built something on his own, a shelter that was now a beacon of hope for those who had been forgotten, just as he had once been. "Why are you here?" Daniel finally asked, his words deliberate but not accusatory. His father sighed, looking down at his shoes for a moment. "I've been watching what you've done here. I know I failed you, Daniel, and I've spent a long time regretting it. But what you're doing here, it's extraordinary. I don't know how I could have missed it all these years, but I want to understand. I want to help." Daniel felt a mixture of disbelief and anger swirl inside him. Help? How could he just walk in now, after all this time, and pretend everything could be fixed with a few words? "You want to help?" Daniel asked, his voice rising slightly. "Where were you when I needed you? Where were you when I was on the streets? When I didn't know if I'd survive another day? And now you think you can just show up and make it all better?" His father flinched, but there was no anger in his eyes, only pain. I don't expect forgiveness, Daniel. I just want a chance to make things right, to help you with what you're building here. You've created something incredible, and I want to be part of it. Not just as your father, but as someone who wants to make a real difference. Daniel stared at him, torn between the man he had once wanted to call Dad and the man who had betrayed him in every way that mattered. The thought of allowing his father into this world, a world he had worked so hard to build, was terrifying. But somewhere deep inside, Daniel knew this was an opportunity, not just for his father, but for himself. It was a chance to heal, to finally close the door on the past. You want to help? Daniel said slowly, his voice steadying. Then prove it. Help us make this place something bigger than it already is. Help us make real, lasting change. His father nodded, the sincerity in his eyes evident. I'll do whatever it takes. I don't care if it's the smallest task or the biggest project. I'm here for you. For the shelter. For these people. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that there could be a place for his father here, that maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild their relationship. Not with grand gestures or apologies, but with action, with a shared purpose. All right, Daniel said. You'll start by meeting with Grace and Jonathan. We've got big plans for the future. I'm going to need all the help I can get. You'll have to prove yourself, but if you're serious, we can make it work. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, plans, and adjustments as Daniel's father, with the help of Grace and Jonathan, began integrating himself into the shelter's efforts. At first, Daniel kept his distance, watching cautiously as his father worked alongside the team. But over time, he saw the genuine effort in his father's eyes. He wasn't just showing up for appearances, he was committed. They began working together on large-scale outreach projects, reaching out to other veteran organizations, lobbying for better policies for homeless veterans, and expanding the shelter's reach. His father's business acumen came in handy when it came to securing partnerships and funding, and his connections opened doors that had previously been closed. But it wasn't just the professional work that started to rebuild their relationship. Slowly, through small moments of kindness and understanding, Daniel began to see his father in a new light. There were no grand gestures, no apologies that could erase the past, but there were quiet conversations, shared moments of effort, and an acknowledgement that the past couldn't be changed, but the future could be shaped together. One evening, as they sat in the office working late, Daniel's father turned to him with a thoughtful expression. You know, when I first walked into this place, his father said, I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. But seeing what you've built, seeing the lives you're changing, I think I found a purpose again. Maybe it's not just about helping others, it's about helping myself too. Daniel looked at him, the distance between them narrowing with each passing day. I think we're both learning, Dad. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to believe in the possibility of reconciliation, not just in his work, but in his life as well. As they continued their journey together, Daniel knew that while they could never undo the past, they could create a new future, one built on second chances, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief that change was possible for everyone. The shelter had become more than just a place for veterans to sleep at night. It was a testament to resilience, a monument to the power of second chances, and a place where broken lives were being stitched back together one small act at a time. Daniel stood at the threshold of this new reality, watching as veterans filed in for a community meeting, their faces filled with hope and determination. As the days passed, the shelter's programs grew. The job training courses flourished, the medical clinic expanded, and the partnerships Daniel had cultivated with local businesses began to yield results. The veterans now had opportunities beyond just survival. They were learning to thrive. But amidst all the outward progress, Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the shelter that was changing. It was him, the weight he had carried for so long, the scars from his past, the anger and betrayal he had buried deep within himself were slowly being released. The act of forgiving, of working side by side with his father, had allowed him to heal in ways he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was real, and it was enough. One afternoon, After a long meeting with local officials about expanding housing for veterans, Daniel walked through the halls of the shelter, his eyes scanning the rooms filled with men and women who had once thought they were forgotten. Now, they were part of something greater, a movement that sought to empower them, not just as veterans, but as human beings with potential. As he passed the makeshift medical area, he noticed a familiar face. A young veteran named Carlos, who had come to the shelter only a few months ago, broken and desperate. Now, Carlos was one of the shelter's most dedicated volunteers, helping newcomers navigate the process and offering a listening ear. Daniel paused to speak with him. "You're doing great work, Carlos," Daniel said, his voice full of pride. "You're making a real difference." Carlos smiled, though there was a touch of humility in his eyes. "I'm just paying it forward, Daniel. You helped me get back on my feet. Now I want to do the same for others. Keep it up. You're part of something bigger than you know." Later that evening, after the shelter had quieted down for the night, Daniel and his father sat in the office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The air between them was comfortable now, free from the tension that had once clouded their interactions. They had both done a lot of work, not just to rebuild the shelter, but to rebuild their relationship. "You know, I was thinking," his father said, his voice thoughtful as he leaned back in his chair. "When you first started this place, you were doing it for them, your fellow veterans. You were doing it because you saw a need. But what I'm realizing now is that you've been doing it for yourself, too. You've been giving yourself the chance to heal, to forgive, to find peace." Daniel looked at him, his father's words resonating deep within him. "I think you're right. I didn't see it at first, but this shelter, this mission, it's given me more than I ever imagined. It's given me a purpose. And more than that, it's given me a sense of belonging, something I thought I'd lost forever." His father nodded, his eyes softening. "I never should have left you. I know I can't change the past, but I'm glad I can be here now. I'm glad I'm able to be part of this with you." Daniel smiled, the last remnants of old bitterness fading into something more constructive, more hopeful. It's never too late to start making things right. It's never too late to change. Weeks turned into months, and the shelter continued to flourish. The outreach programs expanded, offering veterans not just a place to sleep but a chance to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Housing programs became a reality, and partnerships with local businesses resulted in dozens of veterans securing full-time employment. The shelter was no longer just a place for survival. It had become a launchpad for reintegration, a proving ground for the resilience of the human spirit. One particularly cold morning, Daniel and his father stood together on the shelter's new rooftop garden, a project they had embarked on to give the veterans a peaceful space to relax and reflect. The garden had been a labor of love, with the veterans contributing to its design and upkeep, creating a space that was as much about community as it was about nature. "This is incredible," his father said, surveying the garden. "I can't believe how far we've come. From the first donation to this." "We've done it together," Daniel replied, his voice steady, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air like an invisible thread, connecting them in ways words could never fully express. His father placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've done it. You've turned this place into something more than anyone could have imagined." Daniel looked out over the garden, his heart swelling with pride. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. Every veteran here, every volunteer, every donor. They're all part of this." For a moment, they stood in silence, the quiet hum of the city below them, the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. There was no need for words, just the shared understanding that this was more than just a mission. This was a legacy. As the months continued to pass, the shelter's success inspired a wave of change across the city. Other organizations began to model their efforts on what Daniel had built, and soon, the conversation shifted from mere charity to systemic change. The government took notice, pushing for better reintegration programs and more funding for homeless veterans. One evening, as Daniel walked into the shelter after another long day of meetings, he was greeted by Grace, Jonathan, and several of the veterans. They were gathered around a table, working on plans for the next phase of outreach. Daniel's heart lifted as he took in the scene before him. This wasn't just a place of refuge anymore. It was a place of empowerment, of transformation. The veterans were no longer just survivors. They were leaders, advocates, and voices for others who had been forgotten. Grace looked up and smiled. "You've come a long way, Daniel. This place is a testament to your heart, to your drive, and to the people who believed in you." Daniel smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment settle over him. "It's not just my work, it's all of ours. We're changing lives, one person at a time." As the evening wore on, Daniel walked through the halls of the shelter, pausing to speak with the veterans who had come to mean so much to him. He saw in their eyes not just gratitude, but hope, the same hope he had once lost, and the same hope that had brought him back from the brink. Standing at the door of the shelter, looking out over the city that had once seemed so cold and unforgiving, Daniel knew that this was just the beginning. He had taken the hardest steps, the steps toward forgiveness, toward healing. But now, the journey was one of building, of growing, and of helping others find their way. And as he stood there, knowing that his father was by his side and that the veterans were finally getting the second chance they deserved, Daniel realized that the true legacy of this place wasn't just the programs or the partnerships, it was the people. Together, they had built something that would last. Together, they had created a new beginning. And for the first time in his life, Daniel finally felt at peace. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the city as Daniel stood by the window of the shelter's office, looking out over the horizon. It had been a year since he and his father had first come together. A year since the shelter had become a beacon of hope for so many. The walls that once held nothing but despair had been transformed into spaces of encouragement, healing, and growth. As he glanced around the bustling shelter, Daniel saw the faces of veterans who had once felt forgotten now thriving in a community that believed in them. Carlos, the young man he had once helped, was leading a group of new arrivals through the intake process. Grace and Jonathan were coordinating outreach efforts, and his father, standing in the corner of the room, deep in conversation with a donor, was no longer the distant figure from his past, but a genuine ally in the fight for change. Daniel's heart swelled with pride. This wasn't just his achievement. It was the collective effort of everyone who had walked this path with him. His father, the veterans, the volunteers, the donors, and all those who had believed in the mission from the very beginning. Looking out over the city, Daniel understood something profound. While the journey had been long and fraught with pain, it had ultimately led him to something far greater than he had ever imagined. He had found a purpose, a place where he could heal and help others heal as well. He had reclaimed his life and, in doing so, had given others the chance to do the same. The shelter had become more than just a building. It had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no one was ever truly lost. As long as there was hope, there was always a way forward. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey behind him and the promise of the future ahead. With each step he had taken, he had built not just a shelter, but a legacy of compassion, redemption, and second chances. And in the quiet of that moment, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning. The future was bright, and the possibilities were endless. Thank you so much for taking the time to read this story and for joining us on this incredible journey. We hope it touched your heart and inspired you, just as it inspired us to share it with you. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and meaningful content. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue to create stories that make a difference. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story impacted you. Stay tuned for more, and remember, no matter where you are in your journey, there's always hope for a new beginning.